Ukraine?
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me on the programme. Of course, this is nerve-wracking and very worrying, because it would represent yet another red line that President Putin would have crossed in his complete disregard for all international norms and standards since invading Ukraine, particularly coming on the back of all of the stories that you were covering yesterday regarding rape as a weapon of subjugation. But it's important, of course, first and foremost, to establish the facts. There are all kinds of chemical agents. Not all of them are classed as chemical weapons. And clearly, we want to establish those facts. NATO will want to establish those facts before going forward. But as you asked me to speculate a little bit on the reasons, we did see in the last few days a new commander-in-chief of the Russian forces, General Alexander Varnikov, being appointed, who was in Syria and who notably, notoriously, was working with the Assad regime that did use chemical weapons. That has been proven in Syria. And it could also be a sign of Putin's desperation to try to break the resistance in Mariupol before the May the 9th military parade in Moscow. If he can seize Mariupol, he can claim at least the success of his invasion of linking the Donbass to the Crimea, creating that sort of land bridge. So it would again be a worrying sign of Putin prepared to up the ante and use even more brutal tactics. But let's get the facts straight first.
Yeah, let's go back to the facts, because James Heappey, Armed Forces Minister, has today been saying that I don't think it's very helpful to be too binary on this when it comes to chemical weapons. Like you said, things are highly nuanced. For example, a riot may use a form of gas to dispel crowds. But when we talk about a conflict area and collecting the facts for nerve agents, for example, chlorine, sarin, whatever may have been used, how do you go about collecting the evidence? How long does it last for in terms of accessing the area?
Well, certainly chemical weapons can dissipate, unlike biological weapons, quickly into the atmosphere. So you have to be quick in terms of getting your teams in. Fortunately, the Ukrainians still control part of Mariupol. So one question, of course, is to what extent the Ukrainians themselves have that expertise. The NATO countries certainly have been supplying them in recent months with protective equipment, decontamination equipment, forensic equipment. So they will have a certain autonomous capability. But of course, it will also be a question of activating the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons in The Hague, which is under the UN Chemical Weapons Convention Treaty, the organization which really has the international standard, like in Syria, for conducting these kind of investigations and presenting the facts. So it's very much a question of gathering the evidence very quickly. Of course, if people have been injured, they will be in hospital, and obviously medical treatment can also be useful, as in Syria, in ascertaining the use of chemical weapons and being very certain as to the substance. The idea of keeping the OPCW in the loop, of course, is it also helps to continue not just to build credibility, not propaganda, but facts, but also the overall support of the UN General Assembly, the international community, which has been very instrumental so far in isolating the Putin regime.
So it sounds as if, in terms of turning around the fact-finding, that could be fairly quickly done. Again, the UK Armed Forces Minister said that people will be held to account. If we are, for example, taking the OPCW and the fact that Russia is part of that UN mechanism, how do you take and bring President Putin to have his day in court? He doesn't care.
Well, certainly the Russians did try to block the OPCW investigative teams going into Syria, but it was ultimately unsuccessful. Certainly that is a useful precedent here, but certainly also, as I mentioned, the UK, the US, NATO countries have a large number of expert teams, and it's important to put them at the service of the Ukrainians immediately to gather that kind of evidence. Now, the war crimes dossier against Putin is getting heavier and heavier by the day, attacks on nuclear power plants, shelling of civilians, rape as a war crime, interfering with humanitarian relief efforts, and now chemical weapons. What we need to see also is what is the chain of command that has been used to deliver these chemical agents, and who has taken those kind of decisions. But of course, this will be just one more big element in a dossier of war crimes investigations that no doubt await Putin and many other representatives of the regime sooner or later. It takes time, but establishing the facts is critical, of course, for any ultimately successful juridical prosecution.
Well, I suspect that lots of governments, NATO, are going through the iterations, possible iterations of the findings. So let's just say that there is evidence found. Joe Biden has said that NATO would respond in kind. James Heapy again has said that if the red line has been crossed, that all options are on the table. So what options does NATO and do the Western allies have in taking action against Russia? What could they possibly do?
Yeah, excuse me. What we do know is that the US and the UK have anticipated for some time that Russia might use chemical weapons. And as you know, you've reported this on the BBC several times, they have explicitly warned Russia not to do this. And so certainly in NATO countries, between the UK and the US, there have been teams of defense specialists who have been meeting to if you like, look at this option and start preparing options. I don't know, because of course I'm not privy to those confidential discussions, exactly which packet of options that may have decided upon, but certainly giving more weaponry to Ukraine, that's been happening in the last few days, heavier weapons, longer range weapons, more sophisticated weapons, more training, that could be part of the package. We've looked at the war crimes aspect already. We can look at further economic measures and sanctions, more help to the Ukrainians, of course, with that protective and decontamination equipment, which I mentioned too. And there may be options also to interfere with the Russian chain of command when it comes to their ability to carry out these attacks in the future through cover or other type of measures. I don't know ultimately what will be decided. All I can say is that as NATO countries have said they're going to make a forceful response, they have to make that forceful response. It would be, to my mind, a calamity to repeat what happened with the Obama administration in Syria a few years back, when a forceful response was promised. If Assad used chemical weapons, he did so, and that forceful response was not delivered. That set us back several years. So forceful response is required, although I don't know exactly what that will be yet.
I asked this question to a guest in the last hour, comparing what we're seeing now and the possible reaction that could be taken to what was done in Syria when chemical weapons were found to have been used. And some of the Western allies did actually launch cruise missiles targeting the sites where, for example, the planes were taking off that were carrying the chemicals, or where they were stored. And I'm talking about France, UK, the US. Can you see that ever happening again?
Well, I could see it happening again in the case of another Assad or a Colonel Gaddafi or a Milosevic, for example. But of course, since the beginning of the crisis, we have all known that Russia is a nuclear power and a major power with major armed forces. So it's in a different category. So I'm not saying that there aren't certain military options which could be on the table. I've mentioned, for example, already covert operations, cyber operations, and so on. I'm sure that when the Allies say all options on the table, they've been looking at the full panoply of what can be done. And I imagine that a response would contain a variety of different things, like ratcheting up of economic sanctions or weapons to Ukraine. So I don't know is the answer of what exactly that would be. But all I do know is that everybody, I think, recognizes that the failure to respond in Syria a few years back did set us back in being a signal to dictators that they could break international law with impunity. So having said another time that there will be a forceful response, there has to be a forceful response.
We shall certainly see what happens. But for now, Jamie Shea, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, President Vladimir Putin has been telling Russian media today that the military operation in Ukraine would undoubtedly achieve what he said were its noble objectives. He was speaking at an awards ceremony at the Cosmodrome in the Russian Far East with the Belarusian President Lukashenko, and that's where these pictures have come from. Mr. Putin was also quoted as saying that Moscow had no other choice but to launch a military operation to protect Russia, and that a clash with Ukraine's anti-Russian forces had been inevitable. Jenny Hill has been following events from Moscow for us. Hello, Jenny. So just take us through what he's been saying, please.
Vladimir Putin has sought, I think, to re-emphasise his narrative, and that narrative casts his country as the victim here. He's told workers at that space centre that his country had no choice but to go into Ukraine because the government in Kyiv was committing genocide against Russian-speaking populations in the east of the country. It's a baseless accusation, but it is the justification that time and again Vladimir Putin has given for this invasion. Beyond that, though, he has sought again and again to represent Ukraine itself as a threat to Russian security. So we heard more of that from him today, saying that the regime in Kyiv has in effect been nurturing neo-Nazism. It is a powerful narrative, and it is used a lot here to justify this war. Russians are told in terms which very much echo and bring back very long memories of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, as they call it here, in which so many Russians lost their lives fighting German Nazi forces. So that is used again and again to justify the war. So we've had a bit more of that from Vladimir Putin today. He also said that Ukraine was being used as a launch pad for anti-Russian sentiment, anti-Russian in general. Again, sort of telling Russians that, you know, he's not waging war in Ukraine because he really wants to, but because he sees it as a necessary step in order to defend Russian interests. This is, as you know, what Russians are told, because this is all being parroted on state media, very little independent alternatives available. Again, Mr. Putin, very upbeat. You know, he's not admitting that the invasion hasn't gone perhaps according to plan. He's saying that it's all going well, it will achieve its aims, and that the soldiers fighting there are both heroic, they're noble, and that they're using the most modern weaponry wisely and skillfully.
OK, Jenny Hill, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. In his latest address to a foreign parliament, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has told Lithuanian MPs about some of the things that Russian troops are doing. This is what he said.
They don't keep the bodies in the streets. They take them away, they burn them, they do mass deportations from occupied regions. They took away hundreds of thousands of people, deported. They placed them in special filtration camps. They seized the documents. They tortured them. How many of those are killed, it's not known yet. They place them in the regions of Russia and they forbid them to move from there. And it's obvious this is an effort to get rid of evidence of Russian military crimes, war crimes in Ukraine. Is it possible that the Russian military are doing it without the orders coming from their commanders, high commanders? No, it's not possible. Is it possible that the Russian political leaders, they are not aware the consequences, these orders? No, it's not possible. And it's happening in our Ukrainian soil. And why is it happening? And the answer is quite cynical. They're confident, the world will forget about this, will forgive them, or they just could turn away from this.
We can now speak to Mantas Adomėnas, who is the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Lithuania. Thank you very much for joining us this morning here on BBC News. I wonder first off, what do you make of what President Zelensky said today addressing your parliament?
Well, President Zelensky emphasized three elements. One is human rights atrocities committed by Russian army in its occupied areas, Western sanctions, and the implications of the outcome of this war for European security. But underlying thread was the need to revert to kind of principled politics vis-à-vis Russia, vis-à-vis sort of authoritarian regimes by the West. And it is when the West makes compromises and slips up in sort of putting the pragmatic interests ahead of the fundamental values such as rule of law and protection of human life and human freedom and democracy, that space is created for such adventures and such aggression as the Russia's attack on Ukraine. But he's dwelt quite a long time on the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Russia, and the impression that one comes with from all this mounting evidence that Russians are fighting a different war. It's not a war of acquiring territory, but it's a war of extermination. And so, in a sense, the impression grows sort of heavier and heavier that in Putinism we're dealing with a comparable sort of phenomenon to Nazism and Soviet communism in its disregard for human life and for any sort of human decencies.
What would you like the West to do then? Because it sounds as if you feel that more could be done.
Certainly, we can move faster and deeper with sanctions, because sanctions do work, and we can stop Putin's war machine from being constantly oiled with our money. And secondly, of course, is armaments. I mean, Lithuania was the first, regardless of its fairly small size, to deliver Stingers and anti-tank missiles to Ukraine. Of course, I'm totally take account of how much weaponry is being delivered, but we have to be faster because it's a race against time. And if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, we will have to stop him in the Baltic states, in Poland, or in Moldova. So in a sense, we have to do it now. We have to help Ukrainians to win this victory.
How concerned are you about your borders as you watch what is taking place by Russia and also the support it's receiving from Belarus?
Certainly, we are under NATO's umbrella, and we trust sort of that NATO will react forcefully, at least as forcefully as it's assured us. The problem is that currently the existing posture is the tripwire sort of deterrence. That's to say, a token forces in the Baltic countries, which meant that just sort of to act as a deterrence. We need to go to the next step, to have active standing defense. That's to say, to have the capability to defend Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia from a potential aggression either from the east by Russia, from the territory of Belarus, or from the west from Kaliningrad, which is heavily militarized. And recently, there has been an increase of Russian sort of belligerence saying that they want a land corridor to Kaliningrad, and that corridor can only be achieved through the NATO countries' territory, either via Lithuania or via Poland. So, in a sense, this new narrative, which appears sort of, from various Russian administration officials, is a very worrying sign, because usually such sort of, innovations in narrative are led by military adventures and raising military threats.
Your country, the Lithuanian government, has taken some pretty decisive action against Russia. For example, the Russian ambassador has been expelled. The Lithuanian president, has called for Ukraine to be granted candidate status for membership to the EU. You've also stopped importing Russian gas. Any more you could do?
In economic sanctions, we have to move together with the rest of the EU. That's to say, because individual member states, they cannot apply their own sort of economic sanctions policy. If we were allowed to, then certainly there are areas which we would sanction as well. But what we are doing now is working together with our allies to move all the 27 states of the EU to adopt much further reaching sanctions, such as total embargo on oil, phasing out more sort of rapid phasing out of gas, de-swifting banks, and as well as other sanctions that would really hurt the Russian economy and would stop this war machine from grinding on and on.
Vice Minister Mantas Adomėnas, thank you very much for your time on BBC News today. Thank you. Well, as more Russian forces head to the east of the country for a major new offensive